All right, welcome friends. It is good to have you all here. My name is Sam Heath and I work with Equal Justice USA, and I'm the manager of what's called our Evangelical Network. So EJUSA is a national group. We work to repeal the death penalty and to transform the justice system from a place that harms into a place that heals. And we do that in a host of ways across the country, nationally, and with local engagement. And part of what we do is this. It's a webinar series called In the Movement. And the hope with this is to engage and elevate voices in the justice movement. And so today we're going to talk with Dr. Jalane Schmidt. We have lots of questions about things that relate to conversations happening across the country and world. But what's great with this is that it's really locally rooted. So Jalane and I have been in the same rooms and at some of the same demonstrations, but really got to meet and actually speak pretty recently. So let me introduce her and we will jump in. So she's the director of UVA's Democracy Initiatives Memory Project, and she's an associate professor at the Religious Studies Department, which is where I did my degree. I think you came in just right after I did. So Jalane, thank you for giving us your time and being here this morning or afternoon.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for inviting me, Sam.
Yeah. So in one thing that I've read about you, I love this label and want to know if you like it or if it describes you or not. What is a scholar activist? I've heard that applied to you and wonder if you feel that fits who you are and how that captures your work.
Yeah, absolutely. As a scholar, I'm someone that has learned how to conduct research, and also how to, kind of take these raw facts that are found sometimes in an archive or, and other sources and formulate them into into knowledge that is more easily presented to an audience. And in this case, my audience is not only my scholarly peers in the academy, but also kind of a more general public audience. And I do what I call amplify footnotes, by which I mean I take these facts, that were hidden or were hiding in plain sight, not things I made up, but take them and kind of, amplify them into a public square toward a political end. And I'll just give a little example of that, of something that I've done with that, is that in our city of Charlottesville, Virginia, in 2016, we began a process of having public conversations about what we wanted our public spaces to look like and to really consider if, given our professed values for democracy and inclusion, if Confederate statues were really what we wanted to continue having in those spaces. So we were having these, kind of series of meetings, every couple of weeks. What's that?
Is this
the Blue Ribbon Commission
on
Race, Memorials, and Public Spaces. Exactly. Right. So every couple of weeks we'd have a couple-hour meeting, and there would be, people from the public could sign up to talk and this sort of thing. And one of the things that I discovered, I like to use the word Columbus. It was there all along. I didn't, so I can't say I discovered it in that sense, but Columbus did, kind of found it for myself, found it newly relevant, right? Is that in our community of Charlottesville and Albemarle County at the time of the Civil War, 52% of the population had been enslaved. So that's over half of the residents of our community were enslaved, And so what this said to me was, it's like, oh my gosh, if the majority of people here were enslaved, during the Civil War, it's like those statues that were put in, those Confederate statues have been lying to us from day one that they were installed, because the majority of people here were elated, with the victory of Union forces and this sort of thing. So anyway, so I took, this was like a little fact, from the 1860 census, 52% of the residents of this county were enslaved. It wasn't a secret. It was just something that people hadn't really thought about, didn't really know, just because it wasn't really talked about. Anyway, so I took that, and as an activist, organized around that, and helped to kind of mobilize that fact. And so anyway, we showed up at meetings of the Blue Ribbon Commission wearing t-shirts that we'd made that said, "We stand with the 52%. In other words, we're not just some ragtag marginal group of people that you can just dismiss. It's like over half of our neighbors were enslaved then, and these statues have no place in our what are ostensibly public spaces, but
Right.
are really spaces of intimidation if you're anyway. So that's an example of being a scholar activist and doing what I call amplifying footnotes. And it's toward an end. It's not just a fact or a piece of scholarship that you write and it sits on a shelf or only 50 people in your field read it and only 5 of them cite it, in papers. It's taking those facts and kind of framing them in a way toward political ends. It's not just dry facts, academies or something. It's toward a political end to making a point in the public square in order to get a result.
I read once a historian saying that history is not definitive, but is descriptive. And I love that because it's not that he's saying that history is relative. He's just saying our access to it is always hard and limited and through different lenses and biases. And so knowing definitively always what happened, it isn't and really can't be the goal, but we should increasingly be able to describe. And so I hear some of that in what you're saying of wanting to find these things, maybe these are neglected facts, but being able to bring those into a space to be able to actively do something, to call the community into this moment of action.
Right. And our claims are always provisional and subject to correction. I mean, that's part of the academic, scholarly endeavor, is that you make a claim. It's like, based on these sources that I consulted, asking this question, this is what I found. So it's always, and that's why we can have arguments about, historical interpretation and this sort of thing, because somebody else, well, I use these sets of sources, or I used a set of sources that critiqued your set of sources. And that's why I come to this conclusion. Yeah. So it's always provisional. We always have to have some humility and always and be aware that our sources are oftentimes recorded by people who are powerful and have the resources to not only record things, but to maintain it and keep it in an archive and catalog it, right? And all that stuff. So it's like what we can even find. So so if you're like me and trying to work for justice and to make a case that bolsters the humanity of folks who have been dehumanized, by historical forces, that often means reading against the grain of those sources,
Well, it's a posture. I feel it's taking a certain posture toward history of coming under it, hearing what it is, what is there, and then seeing that and then following that and bringing that to a group or two people, rather than the opposite of either, obviously making something up or just going in only to see what it is that you want to see. It's the discipline of the opposite is so much harder. You've talked to me a little bit about the difference of memory and history. What are the differences of those, and why does that matter for your work, especially with something like the UVA Memory Project?
Yeah, well, I mean, history is, it's a kind of collection of events and facts, data, which, may or, may not, be preserved somewhere, can be consulted, these events that have occurred. Whereas memory, takes a portion of history that's been deemed, either, representative or sometimes reprehensible or sometimes laudatory or this sort of thing, and kind of holding it up, for our edification or sometimes as a cautionary tale, right? This sort of thing. But it's prioritizing. Memory kind of prioritizes certain historical facts and says that this is worthy of reflection, an example of that is that, out of the 200 and almost now 50 years of this country, the Civil War was 4 years, 1861 to 1865. It is 4 years, but we take that and we've said, whoa, this is so worthy of reflection, right? That we're going to focus on this, and we're going to in some cases, make heroes of certain people and say these people are exemplary, or we're going to say, wow, these people were really repressed, by the antebellum slave regime, and that's worthy of, focusing on. But memory is a special. It takes props. It takes a certain infrastructure. It takes a lattice work, in order to kind of propagate or encourage memory and reflection. It's about reflection, on certain episodes of history that we've deemed worthy of kind of an extra bit of our attention. You know what I mean? And so we make certain either commemorative events or memorials, monuments, that sort of thing, in order to direct our attention, to certain aspects of history that we're saying, are worthy of more reflection. So that's kind of the difference, between what I say, between history and memory, and how that relates to the memory project at the University of Virginia. So the University of Virginia has what's called the Democracy Initiative here. And within that are a number, about half a dozen or so different laboratories, sometimes we call them, or research centers, or in my case, the Memory Project, that pursues certain tasks, and in the case of the Memory Project, we are attempting to promote more inclusive narratives about our past, and we do that by sponsoring our different art and performative initiatives, such as the Swords into Plowshares Project, which we'll talk about here in just a minute, different commemorative events, and of course, kind of the full, we have academic, kind of seminars, discussions, panel discussions, this sort of thing too, but also these kinds of events and experiences. For instance, something we're doing next month is that we're sponsoring the Civil Rights Tour, where we're taking a delegation of 100 residents of Charlottesville, both town and gown, so community members and folks from the University of Virginia. And we're traveling together through the Deep South, and visiting different sites, of where folks were enslaved, where there were slave rebellions, where there were struggles with the civil rights movement, with the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, or the Whitney Plantation in New Orleans, these sorts of things. So, so this is a way of learning together. And so this is an active memory. It's kind of almost a pilgrimage of sorts, as we are going. Yeah, we're going together. So that's what the Memory Project is about. It's about trying to inculcate more inclusive narratives about our past with a community of folks.
Let me pause and say to those here listening, a few people have come in. So Sam Heath here at the EJUSA and Dr. Jalane Schmidt at UVA is here with us talking about memory and history and monuments. And we'll get into some of her specific work here in the city of Charlottesville. But let me also say, anybody who has a question, you're welcome to put that in the chat or the Q&A, and we'll leave some time at the end for anything specific that you'd like to ask Dr. Schmidt before we finish up our time. So you use the term pilgrimage, which usually is a term, at least in my mind, the connotation is a religious one. And through the Middle Ages and going to these sites and these places that saints may have visited, why do you feel that's such a fitting term for what you all are doing with this? This act that 100 people are doing. That's
right. Well, we did a civil rights, we called it the Civil Rights Pilgrimage in 2018, which was 1 year after what we here in Charlottesville call the Summer of Hate, when we were attacked by violent white supremacists. And the 2018 Civil Rights Pilgrimage was named as such because we had a specific destination, in this case, the Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery, Alabama. And we had a specific, very somber task, actually, which was that the day before we left Charlottesville on our way to the Equal Justice Initiative, which was a week-long trip, we had a ceremony out at the site of a lynching that was just outside of town in our community here. A resident of the community, Mr. John Henry James, was lynched by a white mob in 1898, and so we went to that space where he was lynched, and we had a ceremony there, a ceremony of remembrance. We had two Christian pastors and a Jewish rabbi, and a number of members of the community, members of the descendants of folks who were enslaved around in the area, and other public officials. And, we all went to this lynching site, and we gathered together the soil from that lynching site and put it into a glass receptacle, gallon receptacle. And we took that with us on our bus, with this delegation of 100 individuals. It was actually 115 because some people just kind of dive bombed into to Montgomery to join us. There were a number of public officials that came. And we took this soil from the lynching site to Montgomery with us on that bus tour. And it was a very serious and somber task. It felt like, I'm a religious studies scholar, so I was very conscious of the fact that at that ceremony, as we were gathering the soil, we were in essence creating a relic.
Mm.
That is a, kind of a, holy bits of matter, matter that's been, kind of given an extra bit of meaning, as it were, and taking that physical object, the receptacle and the soil within it with us and caring for it, because we weren't able to be there. We don't know where Mr. James was buried. It was not really recorded. We think, it was kind of a pauper's grave, in one part of a cemetery in town, but we're not sure. And so this was the best we could do to kind of give him, as it were, as proper a burial as we could 120 years after the fact that he was murdered, And so it was a pilgrimage in that we were kind of getting, we were getting closer and closer and, and then finally arriving in Montgomery. And then we had a ceremony there. We had Brian Stevenson came out and addressed us, 100 of us. We had, matching t-shirts and everything, so it was definitely a kind of esprit de corps, that was going on, that we'd all done this solemn task together, to try to repair our community, And so, yeah, and Brian Stevenson told us, he said, you all have set the gold standard, for what a community can do in terms of, recognizing and inculcating memory and, and taking seriously this task of remembrance, And so then we had, kind of a ceremony where we transferred the soil from our receptacle into the ready, the Equal Justice Initiative has these kind of uniform receptacles that they have that they then put on display in their memorial. There's some, I don't know, 800 or a number of hundreds, of these different jars of soil from various lynching sites around the country. And you can see them on the shelf there. And anyway, and so ours, so all of the pilgrims, kind of took a trowel and one by one, kind of transferred that soil, in, kind of with a lot of care, very, and gave it then, and it is now installed there, at the memorial at the Equal Justice Initiative. So that's why, there was this sense of kind of pilgrimage. It's a very deliberate movement, toward a space that is, deemed sacred, or where a sacred task is to take place. In this sense, a kind of, interring almost, as it were, this soil from this lynching site and taking care,
I think about markers and monuments and memorials in the Bible. And a few days ago, we were reading with our kids the Israelites coming in through the Jordan River, and that it had been parted, and Joshua led them through. And one of the first things they did was they built a monument, a marker there to memorialize this moment, to be able to pass down to their kids and say, hey, at this space, this thing happened. Charlottesville and EJI knows this, and that's part of why EJI works hard to change the spaces that it's in, because our public spaces tell a story, and Charlottesville's public spaces have done that for much more than a century, but in a unique way in the last century. But it's been changing as we've been driving around town with our kids. My kids pointed to space and said, Dad, was that where one of the statues was? Because things are gone now. Like the actual visible landscape of our city is changing. I was at a soccer game of theirs a few months ago, and the Lewis and Clark and Sacagawea statue was just there on the side over there, kind of not covered, just
at Dardentow Park there beside the soccer field.
On its way to its next stage.
Right.
And the Lee statue is the one that was of great controversy in the Summer of Hate in 2017, right? Now, people who don't live in Charlottesville might not know there are and were multiple statues, at least 5 or 6 that were lightning rods and all of this, but that Lee statue took a central place. Why was that Lee statue such a central piece in that moment, in that weekend that was there? And then let's tie that to the efforts around it now.
Yeah, well, I mean, we have to look at the kind of the rise of what's called the lost cause interpretation of Civil War history, which was kind of white pro-Confederate Southerners, because there were some white Southerners who were abolitionists and were unionists, and so they get written out of the narrative, unfortunately. But kind of white pro-Confederate Southerners preferred narrative about the history of the Civil War is what is called the lost cause, that this was a noble cause, fought, with feeling and honor, by kind of honorable white Southerners to preserve their way of life, which of course, included chattel slavery as the primary form of wealth there, but that it was no dishonor, to have fought bravely, and kind of a principal figure, saint, if you will, in the pantheon of Confederate heroes was General Robert E. Lee, along with, others such as, especially Stonewall Jackson. We had a statue to each one of these generals in their respective parks downtown in Charlottesville. And so this Lee kind of became a kind of paragon of honor, among those who kind of maintain the flame, of this particular interpretation of history, the lost cause interpretation.
To Lee's chagrin, which I think is important.
What's that?
I said to Lee's chagrin, right? Against his
right. I mean, Lee himself, right. He after the war, and he only lived for 5 years. He died in 1870. He only lived for 5 years after the war, but he was insistent. He said there should not be memorials to the Confederacy. He himself was not buried in his Confederate uniform. There was no Confederate flag at his funeral, nothing of the sort. Lee said, we don't want to kind of tend this, kind of keep this wound open. We need to go forward, and there should not be memorials. Yeah, so that's the first thing. These people who claim to be honoring Lee are actually dishonoring his expressed wish, which was to not have these things. So there's that. And then, yeah, and so this for, part of what's going on with the Confederate States of America is it's, this attempted foundation of a white republic. It's explicitly so, and for these white supremacists and, who call themselves the alt-right, which is the same old white supremacy, just gussied up in polo shirts and khaki pants, they desire their explicit desire is to create a white ethno-state. I'm not making this up. They say this in their own speeches and documents and websites. They want a white ethno-state. They want there to be a kind of ethnic cleansing, or a forced migration of the rest of us who aren't deemed white, out of their hope for white homeland. And so Lee, for them, is a historical figure that they've latched onto, and especially those of kind of the more Southern nationalist variety of these present day white supremacists. And so this is they rightly see in Lee, a figure that was valorized, by, certainly by Confederates, and then their kind of lost cause descendants in various neo-Confederate organizations, whether it's the United Daughters of the Confederacy or the Sons of Confederate Veterans, that kind of tend this flame, of lost cause ardor. And so there was this fixation on the Lee statue, and a fixation on Charlottesville specifically because our city council had voted to remove the Lee statue, and so that put a target on our back, that this town, this university town, a kind of little liberal bubble, in the middle of Central Virginia there, had voted to move on, and that's really what it was about. And it was saying, that this narrative of the lost cause was always exclusive of a large part of our community. And there's now, and some of us have been saying that for years, but now there was kind of a broader consensus in the community that, yeah, this is not what we want in our public space, in what's supposed to be public space. And so we want to remove this in order to kind of create a new environment and public spaces where the community can gather around a common narrative, which is democratic inclusion and a multiracial democracy. And so that's the reason it put a target on our back. And these newly ascendant, white supremacy has never left us. They just kind of went underground under their rocks or in their little chat rooms, on 8chan and 4chan and, Daily Stormer and all those, websites they have. But what happened during the Trump campaign in 2016 is that they came out from under their rocks. They were emboldened. And they specifically said when they came to Charlottesville, David Duke said, out loud, that we are here in support of Donald Trump's agenda. He is our, our hero. They said that they were wearing their MAGA hats, as they came
Richard
into the
Spencer
park.
too was
Yeah, to
explicit
attack
about
us.
that.
Right. What I'm saying is there's a direct correlation
Right.
between the rise of the so-called alt-right and the rise of Donald Trump, who they see as their champion, And so what was happening was that there was this cresting of the energy of these alt-right folks, and more overt rallies that they were having, which were turning violent, in Portland and Berkeley and other places. And they said, let's go to Charlottesville and create another Berkeley. That was their phrase. We're going to make another. Berkeley was the benchmark. Now it's another Charlottesville, of course, let's go to Charlottesville and attack them, because they're trying to do this thing. And it was unite the right. The purpose of the Unite the Right rally was to gather together disparate factions of the far right, Southern nationalists, National Socialists, Nazis, that is, fascists, and other, and so-called alt-right folks like the Proud Boys. Now we see that that's not so innocent, anymore, but the purpose of Unite the Right was to take all of these far right factions and form them into a working coalition of the Trump era. That was the goal of this 2017 Unite the Right. So that's why they descended upon us, and Lee is kind of their totem, it became a symbol, of their cause to have a white ethno state, and thus they attacked Charlottesville for trying to remove that symbol.
There's that haunting photo of the swastika, the flag from Nazi Germany, and the Confederate flag of two gentlemen carrying it, holding it on the streets during the protests here in Charlottesville, which there's an overlap there. And there was an explicit conscious overlap of anti-Semitism and racism, the Confederacy, and all those being tied together. But a friend of mine also pointed out that the flag from Nazi Germany was creased and folded, and because it had likely been recently purchased, that these symbols are still available that are there and are still pursued. And we're very consciously brought in to this moment to overlap a lot of these narratives. And
right.
You're absolutely right about the ethno state. It was earlier that summer in May, and a lot of people don't know or don't talk about this, that during Charlottesville's Festival of Cultures was the first demonstration from Richard Spencer. And they came in the white shirts and the khaki pants, and they marched from the Lee statue down to Stonewall Jackson. And my family had parked our car beside Jackson in the spot, and we were getting in our car as drones were flying around, and Richard Spencer comes on the megaphone and talks about our culture is being stolen. And then of course things culminated 2 months later with all of those events. So Charlottesville became a moment. One piece of history that I think is important to bring out, and I asked this in jest, the Civil War ended and immediately they put up the Lee statue in Charlottesville, right? It was in like 1866.
Nope. And that's part of the discussion here, is that, in our case in Charlottesville, the Lee statue was installed in 1924. So what is that? 60 years, after the end of the war, almost. And the reason, and getting back to the question of memory, the reason that these neo-Confederate organizations, such as the United Daughters of the Confederacy and the Sons of Confederate Veterans, the reason why they coalesced around these efforts to memorialize their heroes with these sculptural monuments like the Lee statue, was that the veterans of the Civil War were dying off. A new generation of white Southerners was coming of age, that had not had firsthand experience with the war, didn't know the history of the war. And so these installations, this was an effort to inculcate among the young, and this was said, multiple times, that this is part of the goal here, is to teach the young who their heroes are, and it's these folks who tried to form a white slaveholding republic, that this, and so it's no accident that at each of these installation ceremonies, of course, there are speeches that are given, and reunions of Confederate veterans and of the UDC and the SCV, and all this, and the children were often given central roles in these installation ceremonies, whether it was, General Lee's great granddaughter pulling the rope that pulled the the veil, off of the statue as it's being, unveiled, which is the title of my documentary that's coming out about all this. So, children doing that, or they're reciting, singing Dixie, or reciting the Bonnie Blue Flag song, all these sorts of activities that drew in children. It's catechetical, to use a phrase, of the same sorts of activities, that are, whether it's in Sunday school or Hebrew school, or, any other kind of religious inculcation. It's very deliberate in order to teach the young. And that's what this is about. So yeah, 60 years after the war, as most of these veterans are dying off, or many of them have, and it's an effort to memorialize and to teach a new generation of white Southerners.
So where does Swords into Plowshares come into this? Because it's in part about removing something, transforming something, and adding something in new. And this is the Lee statue. So what is Swords into Plowshares, and what's your role in that transformative effort?
Well, Swords into Plowshares, of course, is the title of the project. And of course, this phrase comes from Isaiah, a verse from Isaiah. They shall turn their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks, and they shall know war no more. And so it's an effort at repair, by taking a symbol of or a tool, rather. A sword is, it enforces the will of the powerful, with the threat of violence, or with actual violence, is what the sword can do. It can, dismember people and force them to do certain things. And so to take an implement of war, whether it's a spear or a sword, and to turn it into something, into a tool which can cultivate the land, and give sustenance, as a plow can, or a pruning hook can, is it's an apt metaphor for what we're trying to do here with what is an actual military monument here. I mean, Lee was, he's in his military uniform. He's coming back from the war. He's kind of looking kind of dejected, coming back from Appomattox toward his home in Richmond, after his defeat, but we're, taking that, and what would it mean to turn that into something that gives energy to our community, that is a symbol of inclusion. What would that mean to kind of in terms of restoring and repairing the breaches, in our community, So Swords into Plowshares is taking the Lee statue and melting it down and using the resulting bronze ingots to give to an artist, to commission an artist to come in, to listen to our community about what our aspirations are for public space, and to create a new work of public art that can go, in our public spaces, that is more representative of our professed values of multiracial democracy.
You've said before that a monument is a moral recommendation. And maybe even more so in a public park. So how does that play a role in all of this? The Lee monument, where it was within Charlottesville, and then now what might not be in that same spot, but what this new piece might do.
Yeah. Well, of course, the Lee monument was in a central park in Charlottesville, and you mentioned the Festival of Cultures, which took place on May the 13th, 2017, almost exactly 5 years ago, from the recording of this podcast that we're doing here. And as you mentioned, there was the Festival of Cultures was there in what was then called Lee Park, and there were all these, it's like our living room, that park, in our downtown area where the Lee statue stood, was a place where festivals took place, parties, just different gatherings, all sorts of events took place there, because it was kind of a central park, including the event on, the Festivals of Cultures, where there were various booths set up for various different immigrant and refugee groups, in our community, who had set up their, booths representing their national cultures with their, foods and delicacies and dances and music. And, it was all nice. And then here come these, literal, Nazis, came in then to
beating drums in a line with the signs.
To intimidate folks, so anyway, so it's public space. It's, you know, a central place where we gather. And so that's the reason why we didn't want the Lee statue there anymore. And we want something there that draws us together, that represents our common values, not values where, you know, that celebrate a racial hierarchy. You know, somebody who fought to maintain a slaveholding republic. That is not the sort of values that we want to celebrate. And yes, a monument it's making a moral recommendation. You know, it's on public land. It is maintained by our tax dollars, you know, and so it's important, given the central place of the real estate itself, you know, as a central park for our community, and the fact that it's maintained by public dollars makes it all the more important that whatever is placed there is in agreement with our professed values. You know, so that's what's going on there. And you know, and we want to make sure that we are memorializing, or, you know, having monuments to morally edifying figures, events, you know, values, this sort of thing.
So Lewis Nelson is a professor and vice provost at UVA and wrote an article about some of this. And I want to read a quote from him of how he spoke about the statue and the monument, the Lee statue, and what its loss might be. And I also want to ask about how you respond to, how is this not erasing history? But I think this quote will fold into that. So Lewis wrote, he said, "Swords and plowshares will transform a nominally important local object into a nationally important example of art's role in the continuous project of making American democracy. This monument's greatest contribution to the history of American art, in other words, will be its destruction and rebirth." How is that true, if you think it is? How can the destruction of a piece of history actually further history rather than erase it, to go to?
Well, first of all, it's not the destruction of a piece of history. It's, I mean, again, the difference between history and memory. So I just want to, you know, a light on that, you know, to say this. And yeah, in the case of this specific monument to Lee that from Charlottesville, it was a very poorly executed piece of art. It was like, it's like having a middling high school art project in your central park. I mean, that's really what it was. And even at the time it was installed, those who were the boosters of the project, and one of the masters of ceremony at the event writes in his diary about how ugly it is. And one of the speakers at the event, well, there are those who say that this is, you know, kind of out of proportion, but you know, let me, you know, and it's been ugly since day one. The reason it had too many cooks spoil the soup. The original artist died midway through, and his maquette, the model, you know, the clay model that they make, you know, that they base it on, dried up and deteriorated. And then they brought in a new artist, a young artist who just wasn't really accomplished, and he finished it. And the result is, as you would expect, it's like, you know, you look at it and it's like the head is out of proportion to the torso, the gauntlet on the sleeve is out of proportion, the brim of the hat is too, I mean, it's just this Frankenstein statue. I mean, which makes it all the more ridiculous that these white supremacists would you know, go to such great lengths to preserve it. It's just, aesthetically speaking, it is an ugly piece of art. So there's that, you know, and so every other monument that exists of General Lee is by definition of better quality than this one. The art world will not suffer the loss of this particular Lee monument. And as Lewis Nelson said in his op-ed there, a much more significant work of art will result from using the materials, you know, in the way that we are proposing, with community input, you know, with democratic sensibilities, you know, by definition, it's going to be a better work, you know, than this hunk of junk, you know, that sat there for nearly 100 years. And so it's taking, you know, and again, this is an act of memory, you know, the historical facts are still there. The archives are still there. We still know what General Lee was doing on April the 9th, 1865, which was writing his general orders and telling his troops to stand down and surrendering to General Grant. Yeah. We know where he was born. You know, all the historical facts remain. We're not undoing history or destroying history. We are taking a monument, a very poorly crafted one, it needs to be said, and making it, you know, using those materials to fashion something that is more worthy of our public values and of standing in our public spaces because it expresses our values.
How does the process getting there reflect some of those democratic values and spaces, because
Yeah,
in the public
absolutely.
events, the community's been invited in, and there's
Right.
precedent for it with UVA's memorial to enslaved laborers as well, right?
Exactly, exactly. Yeah. So 100 years ago, when these statues were put in, these Confederate statues were put in, it was a handful really of wealthy white people, elites, who made a decision that they wanted to, commission a work of art, and it was going to be installed in a public, and that was, they had their say, and that was it, large swaths of the community were not consulted in this, namely African Americans, who had other heroes. Yeah. And so what we are doing with the Swords into Plowshares project is the opposite of that, is that we are going out to the community with community ambassadors and meeting with different groups, Sunday school books, book clubs, neighborhood associations, etc., classrooms, and talking with people, giving them a survey, about how they feel in public space, what feels good to them, about public space. And if I can I show something here to your viewers? I mean, just kind of some images here, that we're doing is we're asking community groups about how they use public spaces. What does it look like? How do you feel comfortable in public spaces? What makes it feel inviting? And what kinds of how do you feel? With different material artifacts in your public spaces. So we're reaching out, and asking folks, how they feel. And that's what makes it more democratic. It's not just kind of this top down recommend, action that's happening here. People sometimes come and ask, it's like, oh, well, who's going to be the statue now? Or I want Harriet Tubman, a statue of Harriet Tubman. It's like, we don't know yet, because we're not done consulting the community. The community is going to tell us, how they feel. How do you feel in public space, with certain objects there? This stood in front of our courthouse for 111 years, as a statue of a soldier that tried to upend the United States Constitution, stood on the courthouse lawn of a courthouse that is supposedly operating according to the laws of the United States Constitution. It makes no sense. It's it's propaganda of the worst sort, or maybe, a statue, kind of makes you straighten your spine. You feel a little defiant, and this is, the kind of decorations, that festooned, our statue, for many years after we decided to get rid of it, but we're thwarted, here again is the Equal Justice Initiative national memorial to the victims of lynching, and it's just very evocative of caskets or hanging bodies, this sort of thing. It's, if you've ever been there to Montgomery, Alabama, and this was the destination of our pilgrimage in 2018, if you've ever been to the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, and all those etched names, 50 some thousand people, cut down in the flower of youth, and you stand before it and it's just overwhelming, and just, and sobering, to think of this, each individual has a story, a family, a community, that is missing someone, again, in Montgomery, the, Southern Poverty Law Center, here is the, this wonderful quote, from the prophets, quoted by Martin Luther King, that makes us reflect about, what it would mean to have an abundance of justice, flowing down. It's kind of reflection, maybe, and here is the monument, the memorial to enslaved laborers at the University of Virginia. And you can see the eyes of Isabella Gibbons, who'd been enslaved at the university, are etched in to the outside of the memorial. And she's looking out toward the street, looking out toward the community of Charlottesville, kind of gazing out at us, and we're finally seeing, these 4,000 individuals whose enslaved labor, created the university, and sometimes things are just kind of, a curiosity, and we're being drawn in, and we're not really being told what to think. It's just kind of, and this is, I think this might be Chicago. I'm not sure where this is. Or maybe it's, if you've ever been to Berlin, to the memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe, it's overwhelming. Acres and acres and acres of cement blocks, just going on, and you're, dipping down and coming up, there's kind of a topography in there as you're walking through, as well. Or maybe it's whimsical, so we're taking the temperature, as it were, of the public. Like, how do you want to feel, in public space? And that's a totally different thing. Like, oh, what statue do you want in the park? It's like, how do you want to feel?
Right.
What
What
makes
emotions and
you,
in what space? And I know you all have asked questions about even what other materials could be used for this. So it's a question of tone. It might not and likely won't be in formerly called Lee Park. Like there are so many options of where and this could go and what this could be.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. So that's what we mean by having a democratic process. It's consultative, it's evolving. We're going to kind of take what we hear and craft a report for it, to present to the community, to the broader community, and also eventually to present to an artist, that we commission, to create new art, that this is what the community is looking for. And you mentioned the memorial to enslaved laborers at the University of Virginia as a model. And yes, we did a process of community involvement to kind of gauge community sentiment about what would it look like to have a memorial for enslaved laborers at UVA. How would we do that in a way that honors the humanity of folks who were forced to live there in a way that is, reflective, and so there was a special kind of prioritizing. And again, that's the work of memory, right? It's prioritizing certain things. That there was a prioritizing of the voices of the descendants of the enslaved folks who had built UVA. There was, consultation, with the entire community, but there was kind of, just a special kind of leaning in, as it were, to hear what descendants had to say, and that then informed the artist and the landscape designer, in making that beautiful, now award-winning memorial that we have for enslaved laborers, at UVA. So yes, we have experience with doing this in Charlottesville, kind of doing that kind of deep listening, and it takes a long time. It takes much longer. It's much easier, probably cheaper too, for some bunch of rich people, a handful of rich people to just decide that we want to put this statue into this park. And usually the, city leaders are like, oh, okay, fine. We like decoration and sure, let's put a statue there. Yeah. That's the easy way. Democracy is messier and it takes longer, and we have to be brave, to do that, to brave enough to listen to our fellow community members.
It makes me think about restorative justice, and part of the goal of that being to center the needs and the healing of the person who was harmed or the victim, and being able to hear their voice and what does restoration look like for that person. And there's such a measure of that with this process of going to the community and saying, what would restoration from this story, this monument, these events that are now forever attached to it, what would restoration look like? And to be open to whatever that could be. Let me ask one more thing before we see if anybody listening has any questions. How has your faith background and faith journey played a role into putting you in a place to do and advocate for this? Meaning what Swords into Plowshares is doing?
Yeah. Well, I grew up in a Mennonite community. My dad's a Mennonite pastor. I'm a PK, pastor's kid, and grew up in an intentional Christian community that was very much focused on balancing the life of Christian devotion with that of transformation, and also, kind of challenging, the war machine, and our everyday participation in it by dint of paying our taxes, that goes toward destruction, so already, I was raised in a community that was pretty critical, of just the kind of everyday violence of American culture, and so I'm just kind of hardwired, to be skeptical about received narratives, about conventional wisdom, so that, that's important. And also just, being involved in projects and lifestyles that are geared toward transformation, that are envisioning something different than what is, and envisioning, so a third way, sometimes it's called, that it's not just kind of these polarized options here, but something beyond, if we're really looking at restoring relationships, whether it's with one another or the earth, all this sort of thing. And so, yeah, so that is kind of a natural kind of orientation, for looking at a project like this. What would it mean, to not just kind of tit for tat. It's like, okay, we took out the Lee statue, now we're going to put in a statue of Harriet Tubman, or something like what, it's like, no, let's slow down. Let's really slow down, and let's really listen, and let's be deliberative. And that's one of the things that, yeah, growing up in community, in intentional community, it's a lot of meetings, but it's a lot of, self-conscious, and deliberations, to kind of try to reach, something approximating a consensus. We're never going to get all the way there, but where can we kind of, have a sense of, kind of group sentiment that is, that there's enough of a coalescing or around something that we can move forward, in a way. So that is kind of what informs my work on this project, on the Swords into Plowshares project.
Well, let me ask if anybody listening has any questions that you'd like to type in or ask before we start to wrap up. And while I give you all listening a moment to do that, let me ask. So, Jalane, if people can follow you and your work and things that are either there and things that are upcoming and on the way, how can they connect with you and things that you're doing and working on?
Yeah, well, they can go to sipseville.com. That's SIPCville.com. And Sam will send that out to folks after the podcast, the link for that. I'm also, I'm at the Memory Project at the University of Virginia. That's easily Googleable, and Sam can send that out to you. And and that's where we kind of post announcements about our projects and this sort of thing. We're also on Twitter as well. SIPCville is on Twitter, and the Memory Project is also on Twitter, and I'm on Twitter too. It's kind of more me popping off though. But this is, yeah, the different projects we do, have to, are kind of, centered around drawing people into public activities, public events, that are commemorative in nature, that are kind of nurturing a more just vision of our past, and also of what our future might be.
Okay, great. Well, one listener asked, why not leave the space empty, and why replace it with any memorial or art at all?
Oh, that could very well happen. Yeah. Depending on what we hear from the community, maybe it should just be open, or maybe, what's wrong with a couple of park benches and some trees? That could be nice, or a fountain, or yeah, maybe. It could very well be, completely leave it open, and then there would be even more physical space there to have our kind of festivals and the kinds of events we like to have. Could very well be. Or maybe it's a stage, and people come up there and, perform things, or it's maybe a temporary art installation, platform or something with a, kind of rotating, in every 6 months. Who knows? Yeah, it could very well be.
Well, my last question before we wrap up and finish our time is, what is it about this that might uniquely draw people of faith with this process and with these efforts? What is it, whether maybe with the process or its outcome, that might really appeal to people of faith, and especially Christians, that being a big portion of the population in Charlottesville and in Virginia?
Yeah, well, I think just the transformative nature, the goals of the project to be transformative and to seek healing. These are some of the central tenets of the Christian faith, and specifically to, swords into plowshares, going from something that is a tool of enforcement, through violence, and going to and transforming that into a tool that promotes sustenance, is something that is a very biblical vision, and to kind of think about how we might do that in our time, in a very, I don't want to say concrete, and I don't know, in a bronze way, I don't know, but I think it can energize lots of other aspects of our life, not only this public art project of Swords into Plowshares, but in thinking in that way, how do we take something that was harmful and turn it into something that gives healing and restoration? I think that's a way of living out our faith, in the present day, that I think it can be illustrative and energizing for lots of projects that we have going on in the church and society, I mean, there have been some interesting projects here in our town, in Charlottesville. We have, of course, affordable housing and, a deficit of affordable units, right? And there have been a couple of churches who have kind of looked around, and what's the problem with affordability? It's often the overvaluing of land and the scarcity of land, a kind of, a supply and demand problem. What do churches have a lot of? Got a lot of parking lots.
Yeah.
Parking lots that are used a few times a week, maybe, or a portion, you know what I mean? And it's a poor use of land. And so we've have a couple of churches here in town that are doing great work. Park Street Christian Church there, and Hinton Avenue Methodist there, just to name a couple, who are saying, hey, we've got land. Let's build some affordable units here. Let's build a community that's multi-generational, that has like a place for elder folks, and also a daycare center for kids, and a kind of common area to be in, and so, and so, taking something, a parking lot, oh my goodness, I mean, what a waste, of space to, park your steel and plastic on, you know what I mean? And also just, kind of the all sorts of things it does for, drainage, and it's bad for the environment. And so many, what would it mean to take something that was meant for car culture, which has been so destructive of our social fabric too? That's a whole nother discussion, to take that and to turn it into a garden, and or spaces where folks can come together in a community. These are some of this. So this is a model, for taking something harmful and seeing how it can, like, in a very practical way, have adaptive reuse for something that's life-giving.
You quoted the verse from Isaiah, or part of it, a little earlier. Let me end just with reading that full verse, and then we'll close out our time. So Isaiah 2:4, talking about God shall judge between the nations and shall decide disputes for many peoples, and they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. So
Amen.
We'll send out to those listening to the video from this time, links to the things that you mentioned. Jalane Schmidt, thank you so much for giving of your time. Blessings on your efforts of safety and fruitfulness and peace and all that you are doing. So thank you so much, friend.
All right. Thanks.
All right. Bye-bye.